there is a $3 trillion racial wealth gap between Black and white households. $3 trillion. Over 40% of that is attributed to housing. That's so important for everyone to understand here. In the 1960s, the homeownership gap was 27%. Today, it is 29%. It has grown. In the rentals space, to even get into homeownership, 43% or more in application fees people of color pay than their white counterparts. They are twice as likely to submit 5 or more applications, so they are paying that much more in application fees just to get a rental. In the mortgage space, Black mortgage applicants are denied a loan 84% more than their counterparts. And we should talk about what resources are lacking in these communities. Black communities have between 40 and 90% fewer traditional financial institutions. It's a tragic situation. So with that, I'm going to say, why are we all here today? I will start with Braden, actually, from Design the We. If you could talk about how you came up with the exhibit that is out in the exhibit hall, and we can start from there.
Amazing, yeah, thank you. Thank you all for inviting me here. The Undesign the Redline exhibit, I really encourage everyone to see it. Myself and actually my co-founder, April, our co-founder, is over here. Wave, April. Sorry, you know I made you do that. We created this exhibit, in 2015, I want to say, and we came together out of grad school, really looking in the space of housing, economic development, community development, and finding that there really wasn't a shared story for how we got here. And because of that, there weren't policy solutions that were really being pushed forward, the needed policy solutions that we knew we needed. And there was a sense that redlining, although maybe a lot of the folks in this room we know this story, right? But the public in general doesn't. And the history is an explanation of the present. The history explains how we got here. And redlining is a critical piece to understanding how did we go from this Jim Crow era racism, where it's written in black and white, and get designed into the structural racism that we see today in housing and geography in our cities. And when that story isn't told, and there's a lot of people that don't want to tell that story, it allows for other explanations, right? Oh, people don't work hard enough. Oh, it's their fault. And that story is still here. Yeah. And it's being pushed. And this history and telling the story not only of redlining, but there's so many policies that have led us to where we are today, became something that we really felt was needed. And since then, the exhibit really has taken on a life of its own. There's so many people who've been involved. It goes around to communities all around the country. We bring together community members to help tell the local stories. And it's just become its own whole world. And it's been amazing to see that.
That's excellent. Lisa, I would love to talk and introduce everyone to the work you're doing at NAFA and talking about some of the priorities, even that are outlined in the exhibit that Braden's been discussing.
Sure, Jen. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is a really important discussion about how we can dismantle redlining and implement solutions that lead us all to more equitable outcomes. So we have a number of priorities at the National Fair Housing Alliance. First, for those who don't know who we are, let me level set a little bit and tell you a little bit about the wonderful organization that I have a privilege to work for. The National Fair Housing Alliance is the nation's only national civil rights agency working to eliminate all forms of housing and lending discrimination, and also to create well-resourced communities where people really have access to the amenities and resources that they need to thrive. I'll talk about three main priorities that we're undertaking right now at the National Fair Housing Alliance. We are also the trade association for all fair housing groups throughout the country. So we are steeped in community. We are steeped in neighborhoods throughout the nation. The first is advancing responsible AI and tech equity. This is work we've been doing since our inception. We're 35 years old. We just celebrated our 35th year anniversary this year, along with the 55th year anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. So under that work to advance responsible AI and tech equity, we are doing 5 things. So the first is developing solutions to remove bias from the technologies that impact our lives. In the housing and lending space, we deal with a lot of algorithms, credit scoring systems, insurance scoring systems, automated underwriting systems, et cetera, and they all perpetuate bias. So we're using artificial intelligence for good to develop solutions to reduce the violence, to silence the bias in those technologies. We're also using tools to increase the transparency and explainability of AI-driven tools. We're conducting research to identify and measure bias and try to innovate around new ways to mitigate algorithmic bias. We're also creating policies that advance responsible AI, and then we're engaging in work to increase the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the tech space. Our second major priority is reducing the racial wealth and homeownership gaps, and we have a number of initiatives under that, which I think I'll talk about more as the conversation progresses. And then the third priority is, I think, Jen, quite frankly, probably what we're most known for, and that is our work to enforce the nation's civil rights laws. So we are the agency that conducts investigations of discrimination across the nation, and then we bring litigation or administrative actions to address any discriminatory findings.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Wendy, I would love to talk about or introduce the work that you're doing at the Mortgage Bankers Association, and especially around the Convergence Initiative.
Great, thank you. And it is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. The Mortgage Bankers Association is the trade association for the real estate finance industry. Our membership is made up of all types of lending institutions and the service providers that serve those organizations. So think about large banks like Bank of America, Wells Fargo, TD Bank, but also credit unions, regional banks, independent mortgage brokers, and then also the organizations that provide data and information and run the technology. So all of those organizations belong to MBA. As a trade association, we do focus a lot on policy, both at the federal and state and local levels. But the team that I am on, the Affordable Housing Initiatives team, we look at what we call market-based solutions. So programs, products, things that our members can institute. So maybe a special purpose credit program that we'll probably hear a little bit about later today, or a first-time homebuyer program, down payment assistance, things that these organizations can take on for themselves to decide this is something that I want to do to provide a solution to increasing affordability. And the Convergence program that Jen just mentioned is a primary role of mine at MBA. And it's an initiative that started in about 2019, and it really brings together local housing advocates. Think about your housing counselors, community development corporations, but also local real estate professionals, local lenders, and the different branches that they have. And pairs that with resources from a national level, so trade associations like MBA. Also think about the GSE, so Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and then those providers that I mentioned, those affiliate members, like a group called iEmergent that provides a great deal of data for the real estate finance industry. So the idea is we create a coalition to address local housing issues, which a coalition is not a new idea, but bringing in the resources and support from a national standpoint is what I think really sets it apart. And the goal is to increase minority homeownership, particularly Black and Hispanic homeownership, by addressing gaps that cause barriers to people getting into homes. The first being the information gap, which is about the incorrect information that's out there about the home buying process. So think about people believing they need 20% down or that they need perfect credit in order to buy a home. So they self-select out and maybe don't even try. The trust gap, which is really a focus of what we're talking about here today. People don't even try because they believe they will be mistreated by lending institutions and others in the real estate arena because of things like redlining and racially restrictive covenants, but also from seeing a friend or family member lose a home to foreclosure. So again, people self-select out, they don't even try. We also look at resource gaps, think about the actual money that it takes to purchase a home, whether that's a special loan program or a closing cost assistance, those types of things. And then the market gap, so looking at housing supply, recognizing that that's a huge issue, but really the program through Convergence, we look at working with smaller nonprofit and minority developers to help with infill developments in the cities where we operate.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to note what you talked about when people self-select out. It's not just the policies, the infrastructure, but the impact on people and the people's stories. And actually, Congresswoman, I know we talked about. You actually have a personal story to share that can maybe humanize this discussion before we really get into some potential solutions.
Absolutely. So I tell the story of my family. I was born in Korea. My father served in the Army where he met my mother, so I'm half Black and half Korean. We moved to the States, and we landed in Virginia before Loving v. Virginia existed. And this is not a conversation about home ownership, but it's about our family's journey to be securely housed. My father wearing his Army uniform and his bride, my mother, dressed for church, and their 1.5-year-old infant daughter, Marilyn, drove around all night long in Richmond because no one would rent a motel room to us. And finally, someone who was a proprietor took mercy on us and let us stay there. This was my mother's introduction to the United States. And that attitude and understanding stayed with her until the day she died last June. And I say this because we ended up moving to Washington, and we were able to buy a house in 1967 in South Tacoma in a predominantly what I call white working class neighborhood. So we were the first Black family on our block. And we were able to get that loan because it was through the credit union on the military base. That house was $17,000 in 1968. That house was paid off before I graduated from college. And that house stayed in my family until my mother passed away last year. It is still in my family. A commuter rail station was put 4 blocks from that house. That house quadrupled in value in a very short period of time. And the point I make is this: my family had an anchor of wealth and prosperity. And because of that, they were able to qualify for car loans that weren't predatory. They were able to get loans for other things. And so this whole idea of having a home as a base of wealth is so incredibly important to our community. But often in order to be able to purchase a home, you have to show that you have a history of being a good renter. We rented a house about 4 blocks away for about a year before we bought that house. And so the trajectory to my family coming here, being turned away from a motel room, to owning a home in the late 60s, to having a house worth now $500,000, which is big money in Tacoma, Washington. That's a really big deal and a trajectory that shows how a family can build wealth, especially because African Americans were denied land grants that were promised 400 years ago. If we had had those, if the promise had been fulfilled, then the intergenerational wealth that so many others enjoyed would be part of our experience too. But I think that humanizing the story and just talking about the way owning a home, being able to rent, is such an anchor to our prosperity is incredibly important. And a lot of our theme this week is about wealth building as a civil rights issue. So again, this is how home ownership and even the ability to rent helps a family build wealth.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. So Braden, I'd love to talk more about the work that you're doing. And again, another plug, if you haven't seen the exhibit outside, you really do. It's an immersive, impressive exhibit. If we can talk about your experience with how this work has been impacting policy, about how people think about this issue. I mean, there's such a wealth of information that a lot of people don't know and they need to know if we're going to make smart policy moving forward. So would love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. You know, one of the things, and leave this for the exhibit, but the history of it is something that a lot of folks are familiar with, but I'll say especially white folks are not, and are often shocked. Oh, wow, it was really that explicit? And these are the people, oftentimes of halls of power, that are making decisions, and yet really have no clear story of how we got here. And one of the things you were talking about, how things perpetuate bias. Well, we often say, if you're not really deliberately undoing and healing and repairing this history, you're probably reproducing it, right? There isn't this middle ground in between where you're not. And so one of the amazing things about the exhibit, I said, it has a life of its own, and in so many places, folks have been able to use it. We're real organizers, not just about education, but about mobilizing folks. And we've seen fair housing legislation, for example, in New Orleans, the city council came through. We're very proud to say the exhibit was present and used as a tool during Robin Rue Simmons' campaign for the first successful municipal reparations policy in the US, which was down payment assistance grants for folks who've been cut out of home ownership. And we just recently, it's in Columbus, Ohio, and the city was using it as part of their complete revamping of the zoning code there to get rid of exclusionary zoning, which is when, usually whiter, wealthier communities, the ones that were greenlined, right, on those maps, have been excluding new development, new and affordable housing, and new folks from moving in. And so, there's so many examples of that, from the grassroots and emergent stuff to real, campaigns like the amazing work of the reparations work that we've seen. I think that those stories around the country are bubbling up all the time. And I think it's a really wonderful thing and something that we don't focus on enough in some ways. I really wish that, I was saying that I think that really housing is such a central piece to the American story. It's so central to our lives. It touches all of us. It should be front and center in our politics, in our conversation right now, and the work that people are doing to really change this history. We need to lift them up.
Yeah, I'd like to add something too, because we're focused on the discussion of housing, but I want to make sure that we understand some of the other issues that are very relevant to it. Whenever we talk about expanding transit lines, there are often conversations that happen in communities about not wanting those people to come to our neighborhood. That's redlining, because they're afraid the neighborhood is going to be more inclusive. It may include renters, it may include people from all backgrounds, but unfortunately, you often hear conversations from people who are not supportive of expanding mass transit or public transit or streetcar or light rail because they don't want those people coming into those neighborhoods. That is redlining.
Thank you. Something that Braden said, I think it makes me think about what I say all the time. It's important to be intentionally good instead of unintentionally bad. And to make the targeted investments that, quite frankly, the result of redlining was targeted divestments. And so, Lisa, I would love to toss it to you. NAFA has done this really great, which Zillow has partnered with you on the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative, where you targeted certain cities around the country. Would love to have you talk more about the initiative and what NAFA's learned.
Yeah, Jen, I'm happy to do that. So our Keys Unlock Dreams initiative is designed to reduce the racial wealth and homeownership gaps in the United States. I mean, you mentioned that there is a almost 30 percentage point difference between the black and the white homeownership rate. The black homeownership rate is just a little bit above 44%. The white homeownership rate is 74%. So the white homeownership rate is almost 70% higher than the black homeownership rate. And that is not by happenstance. As you've heard Braden and others say, it is on purpose. We designed it that way. And it is very much systemic. One of the first things that NAFA partnered with Zillow on was around our Where You Live Matters framework, in which we showed, and thank you to Zillow for doing this amazing research for us. Braden talked about how our communities today became hyper-segregated in part because of these redlining practices perpetuated by the federal government and other industry stakeholders. We are more segregated today than we were 100 years ago. And because we are so segregated, we have distinct black and white communities. Resources then get distributed based on where you live, right? And so Zillow's research showed that in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods throughout the United States, there are literally per capita fewer health institutions. There are fewer quality financial institutions like banks and credit unions. There are fewer full-service healthy grocery stores, right? There are fewer recreational facilities. There are fewer green spaces in communities of color. But conversely, in predominantly black and Latino neighborhoods, there are more payday lenders and check cashers and predatory lenders. And so the resources that are tied to community are very different, and because of that, have very real impacts on our lives and what happens to us. In the United States, where you live impacts your educational outcomes, it impacts your net worth, it impacts, as Congresswoman said, how long you will live. That's crazy. So the Keys Unlock Dreams initiative is designed to undo all of that, and we are utilizing numerous policy levers as well as programmatic levers in order to increase and expand opportunity for people and to dismantle systemic racism and replace those systems with fair and equitable systems. So we're dismantling the our biased appraisal system. We're dismantling the dual credit market. We are dismantling all of these sort of systemic barriers that lock people out of opportunity. Now, unfortunately, sometimes we also have to use the enforcement lever. We're trying not to do that, but at the last resort, we sometimes have to do that. But we're using all of these levers to really flip the paradigm, to make communities more equitable and fair and ensure that people can have opportunities to really the resources that they deserve.
Thank you. So Wendy,
Sorry, Jennifer, can I say one more thing?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So when the COVID pandemic hit, everybody said we were going to have another foreclosure crisis in the United States. Everybody did. And they started calling it the COVID foreclosure crisis. It never happened. In fact, the black homeownership rate increased from 2019 to 2022. Why? Because we implemented intentional policies to stave off a national foreclosure crisis and to deliver resources to the people who most needed it on an equitable basis. Now, I will say, when the Paycheck Protection Program, the PPP program, first hit, it was quite inequitable. In fact, 95% of black-owned businesses couldn't access the PPP funds. But our public policy team worked with Congress, thank you very much, to change the PPP program and to make it equitable. And then we saw much more access from Black people and Latino people who own businesses. But that's just an example of the outcomes that we can see with intentionality and deliberate, targeted, very precise mechanisms to deliver equity to the people who need it most.
I appreciate you making a finer point on that. That's important. And it's important that there are solutions out there. We've been talking about the challenges for so long, but the solutions are there, they work. We just really need more of that intentional investment. So Wendy, brings me to you. I know you were talking about the gaps. And the trust gap is interesting. I mean, I think you should talk about all of them, but what in particular is either through convergence or MBA doing writ large to close these gaps?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, trust is huge. And when we were preparing for this panel, something you said really stuck out. And help me if I get it wrong, but that trust is lost in buckets and gained in drops. Yeah, so very true. And so when you think about it, I mean, it's a reality. Many people do not trust the lending system, bankers, and so for MBA to say, okay, here we come, we're coming into your community and we're going to help out. The idea of convergence is really that we are first trying to amplify what already exists. The answers, to your point, are already there in the local community. Bringing in national level resources and access to information, data sets, financial resources that some of the local nonprofit organizations wouldn't otherwise have is the role that MBA plays. We are the convener and we help to build those connections. But we also realize we don't want to go where we're not welcome. So we don't just show up. We are very intentional about understanding the local housing ecosystems where we go, and we talk to the nonprofits who are there, and then we say, well, who should we talk to next? Who is the leader here? And because what we want to do is amplify those voices. They are the trusted resources, not us, not our data partners, not even the GSEs, even though people know who Fannie and Freddie are, but that's not who someone who is looking to buy a home and is reluctant or afraid really wants to hear from. And I should mention that we are in 3 cities right now, Memphis, Tennessee, Columbus, Ohio, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And if I could really illustrate, use an example from Columbus about how we really use the local organizations to help build trust and to be the trusted voice when we're talking about home ownership. Convergence Columbus recently as in less than a week ago, launched a consumer-facing website called bloom614.org, so BLOOM614.org. It's a site where a person can go to get information about purchasing and owning a home, but when I say it was locally created, it was locally created. We worked with a minority-owned creative firm. We worked with the Housing Authority to hold focus groups to talk to people who wanted, they're renters, but they want to be homeowners, to really understand what does homeownership mean to you. When we talk about what does it mean, and people talked about wanting a safe place for their children to grow up, or not to have to change schools every year. All of these things that we know that we believe we know that that's what people want, but to really hear it from people who are in a situation where I'm trying to buy a home and I don't know what to do. So this creative team used all of that information. That's where Bloom came from, because listening to that, that's what came to mind when you talked about home ownership, something blooming, something new, something growing, a new opportunity. And then 614 is the area code in Columbus. But it's this beautiful site, and if you go to it, it's no stock photos. There are photographs of people who live in Columbus. There are photographs of real estate professionals and lenders who look like the community that we're trying to serve. There's a ton of great information on there about the home buying process. It is not that different from any information you're going to find on another site. But the people in Columbus know they can trust that website because it was created in Columbus. The people on the site are from Columbus. The testimonials are from people in Columbus. There's nothing about, there might be the MBA logo or convergence might be on there somewhere, but it's really about Bloom. It's about community. It's about growing. And so we're helping to spread the word, but we're building trust by having all of it come from, it started with the Housing Authority, giving us access or helping us connect with people who had the true insight about what it means to be a homeowner. And so that's what we're trying to do in all the cities. And so we take what we learn from an example like that, and then we'll go to another city. The website, the color scheme or those sorts of things might look different, but what we've learned is start with the residents, have these focus groups, understand what homeownership means at that local level. And so that really is the goal of convergence. We take what we learn and then we're able to scale and replicate these solutions in other places, all the while building trust because we start at the local level.
Yeah. And so local matters and talking about these focus groups and talking about the people that these policies are impacting. Congressman, to toss it back to you, can you tell us more about what your constituents are saying, what you're learning from them, maybe something that we haven't talked about that you want to add, or something you want to double down on that you just want to reemphasize?
So I represent the 10th Congressional District of Washington State, so I'm along what I call the I-5 corridor along the Metro Seattle area. And like many regions around the country, we have a housing crisis. We have a short supply that's not keeping up with demand. We have people who are elders who have a ton of equity in their homes, but if they sold their home and wanted to move somewhere else to own, they couldn't afford anything. And so a lot of people, what I call house rich stuck. They've built up all this equity, they've paid into these mortgages for years, and at the same time, they're stuck in this home. So the thing I hear about most, housing affordability, and that is directly tied to supply. I hear about lack of affordable housing for people on the lower end of the income scale. That's very common. And then when it comes to housing too, I think it's the things that we typically hear. The interest rates are too high. People won't lend to me, all those different things. And then on top of that too, in many places, wages do not keep up with what it requires to only spend 30% of your income on your housing. And so I think it boils down to a supply issue. One thing I want to add though, there are some subdivisions, in our region that were built in the 50s or 60s. And if you look through their homeowners association documents, there are covenants that they've never eliminated or voted on as HOA members that say things like, no one of Asian or Black or Latino descent can live here unless they are a servant or something. And you would think that those things would be taken care of, but they still exist. Now, they cannot be enforced. I mean, an organization like yours would come after them in a heartbeat. But I think that when we talk about the history of housing and redlining and discrimination, it comes in so many different forms. But I would say more than anything, it's affordability. Yeah. People's wages, benefits, and retirements aren't keeping up with the cost of living. And even if you're house rich, you're stuck in it because your alternative is something just as expensive, if not more.
Yeah. I appreciate you talking about that. I wonder, Braden, is there anything, we feel like we keep kind of glossing over there's so much information on that exhibit, but, talking about these restrictive covenants, are there other things that you want to address from the exhibit that you think should be introduced into this conversation?
Well, one of the things that the exhibit tries to do, you look at something like racial covenants, which, okay, we had the 68 Fair Housing Act. They're not enforceable. By the way, they're still in a lot of deeds. And by the way, they're still embedded in the mentality around American real estate. Right. And, whether that's racial steering or that's appraisal bias, you see all these different pieces. And I think that what is just most important to talk about this history, and I think someone said it, this is not an artifact of the past. This is how we got to where we are. There's a cascade of policies and a cascade of decisions. In New York State, where I live, we just had a big push to change the zoning around particularly transit areas and rich areas where there's not diverse housing, and there's a huge fight. And if you listen to some of the things people are saying about their fears about what's going to happen, and you look at some of the language in these documents, which goes back to 1910, wow, this is pretty much the same thing. There's a couple words changed. And so we still are embedded in the same stories. We're still embedded in the same world that redlining created, that these policies created. And I think that that's the piece that people really don't really fully grasp in this history, that it created the world we're living in.
I want to add one thing to that too. So in one of the nicer single-family home neighborhoods, a developer bought 2 parcels and it was zoned to allow mixed use. So that's multifamily housing, apartments, condos with retail on the bottom. Some of these neighborhoods have the time and the means to litigate everything. So to your point about local land use being the biggest barrier to adding more housing in this country. They have the time, they have the money, they will litigate, and then someone gives up. I remember hearing about one of the hearings with the City of Tacoma's land use people, and people actually said, when those apartments get built, there are going to be snipers on the roof of the middle school, and they're going to hurt those children. This is not a joke. This is what people said as some of their reasons for not wanting to allow apartments into their single-family neighborhood in a place that was zoned to allow it. So to your point about local land use and sometimes the neighbors themselves who will have a Black Lives Matter sticker in their window, love is love, but no upzoning.
Well, so staying in Washington State, actually, Zillow helped to pass legislation creating a new special purpose credit program, providing low-interest loans for down payments for groups historically harmed by racially restrictive covenants. Lisa, I know you've been working on this issue of special purpose credit programs as well. Tell us more about what NAPA is up to in this space.
Sure, Jen. This is something that I love talking about, so you all shut me up. So we've been talking about, right, how our systems in the housing and financial services space are systemically unfair. They are systemically racist, right? We have, and that is because those systems have been built literally from hundreds of years, as Congresswoman Strickland explained, hundreds of years of race-conscious, race-based policies that created things like our biased appraisal system, residential segregation, the dual credit market, et cetera. Let me just say that today, Jen, banks are closing their branches at higher rates in affluent, high-income Black communities at a higher rate than they're closing their branches in low-income, non-Black communities. So this is not an issue of economics, it is an issue of race. I explained earlier about how all of the algorithmic solutions we're using in the financial services space generate bias. We know this. Risk-based pricing systems, these are the algorithms that determine how much you're going to pay for credit. Right now, today, Black and Latino mortgage owners are paying $765 million every year in increased costs. In other words, they were charged more than they should have been charged by these algorithmic-based systems, right? So how are we going to ever reach equity if we've got to deal with these systems that are unfair? It's not going to happen. Now, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act says that there is this special carve-out. They're called special purpose credit programs. They've been on the books for 50 years. And the Equal Credit Opportunity Act says that financial institutions, nonprofit entities, units of government can establish these special purpose credit programs that are designed to deliver equitable outcomes. And if you design a special purpose credit program for a particular group of people, Native Americans, Black people, Latino people, Asian Americans, if you do it legally, you will not be violating the law. It is a legal affirmative action provision. What happened is, I said that these programs are 50 years old. Lenders were not standing them up, quite frankly, because their prudential regulators were telling them Okay, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act may let you stand up a special purpose credit program, but the Fair Housing Act won't let you do it. And so we worked with HUD to get HUD to release major guidance that says special purpose credit programs do not violate the provisions of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And since we got that guidance from HUD, literally the floodgates have opened, and we have lending institutions that have established these special purpose credit programs. And NAFA has been partnering with the Mortgage Bankers Association to stand up these programs. And in fact, we have released a toolkit. It's the spcptoolkit.com that explains how these programs can be set up. And now we have units of government like the state of Washington who looked at special credit programs and said, wait a minute, can we use special purpose credit programs to remedy racially restrictive covenants that we sanctioned in the state of Washington? Can we overcome this redlining bias via special purpose credit programs? And so the state of Washington has commissioned the National Fair Housing Alliance to conduct a study to look at the implications of the racially restrictive covenants and to determine if a special purpose credit program would be viable. I must give a shout out to Zillow, and I'm not just saying this because we're on this panel sponsored by Zillow, because I also give a shout out to JP Morgan Chase. But Zillow actually testified, this is so rare, Zillow actually testified before the state legislature in support of this covenant homeownership program. Now, I have to say we're being very circumspect, we're being very judicious, we're being very careful because someone may want to sue us, but we are doing it so carefully that we believe we'll be able to withstand any legal threat to the development and implementation of the state-sponsored special purpose credit program. And we believe that what the state of Washington is doing can serve as a model for other states to do the same thing.
And I want to add one thing. And I can't verify this as a true fact, but one of the reasons that you had these two entities, Zillow and JP Morgan Chase, willing to testify in front of the state legislature, you had women of color at those organizations in top positions who raised the flag and said this is important to our organization. So when people say to you, does representation matter? Absolutely it does.
And the thing that I'll say too about special purpose credit programs and other equitable provisions like first generation home buyer programs is these are tools that improve and enhance our economy. Citigroup did some important research in which Citigroup found that if we just eliminated racial inequality against Black people alone, we would increase the US GDP by $5 trillion. Why would we want to hold back that kind of economic evolution? That doesn't make sense. So these equitable provisions really are tides that lift everybody's boat.
I appreciate everything that's been said here because, I mean, even Lisa and I were just talking about this. I mean, I said this earlier, I really am so proud to do this work. And it's not necessarily privileged. I feel like I worked really hard to get here. And, you know, I started at Zillow when we were during Zillow's 10-year anniversary. And I often say it was a bunch of engineers to build the widget. It was a bunch of marketers to push the widget out. But it still really fundamentally operated as a startup. And there was just a lack of overall knowledge and education about all of these issues that we're discussing. But why I'm so proud is that when talking about these issues to leadership, they're responding. We are able to make changes. And I often talk about, you know, how we show up is through our product, through policy, and through partnerships. I've been trying to be quieter in this panel because it's not about Zillow. It's about all of the work that all of you are doing on the ground day in, day out. And, if we can support this conversation here and further and in the halls of Congress, we should absolutely do that. But you're right, representation does matter. Fair housing is very important to me. It's important to our constituents, to those who use our platform. And so I really feel like this has been such an impactful conversation. I really do appreciate it. And so as we're starting to wrap up, I would love for everyone to talk about what's the one thing that you would want everyone to walk away from this conversation with knowing, or if you want to underscore a point that was made earlier. And Wendy, I'll start with you.
Sure. Not to sound like a broken record, but going back to trust and building trust is incredibly important. The trust that we're building in the different cities where we're working on convergence isn't just with consumers to professionals, it's from professionals to professionals, because there's a lot of mistrust between how real estate professionals and counselors and lenders work together. But what we're finding is when you get people together in something like a collaboration, when folks get to know each other on a personal level and they can understand, I get to know Jen as a person, then I have more trust for Zillow. If I get to know Lisa as a person, and so on and so on. So don't underestimate the power of just a simple conversation. If you're not sure where to start, you want to launch a program, you want to take on an initiative, start by getting to know the people in different organizations and start to maybe develop some of these cross-sector relationships. And that's how organizations can start to trust one another and communities start to trust one another. So I guess the takeaway is just don't underestimate the power of that human connection when you're trying to repair some of the trust that has been damaged.
Yeah, that's great. I think, one thing that I keep thinking about with our exhibit, and especially in this moment, there's a pushback as well. And, we're in a moment, and we need, and what I'm hearing here and what is happening this week, the drumbeat. We need to be out there. We need to be telling a very clear story. We know what happened. Actually, we're correct. We are the ones, we're right. We have the data, okay? We know the history. This is what happened. This is what our country is, and we can be something better. And we need to be able to really articulate that story and really change the hearts and minds, because I think right now there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of other stories that are trying to be pushed. So I really hope that we don't miss that moment and we keep on the drumbeat.
Yeah, and I would love to encourage everyone to please go visit the exhibit, Undesign the Red Line. If you have not seen it, please, please, please go see it. It is chock full of some really great information, and it's information that you need to arm yourselves with as you go back to your communities or the spaces where you work. You need to arm yourself with that information so that you can push for these equitable provisions that you've heard us all talk about. Let me double down and say affirmative action is not dead. It is very much alive. It is legal. It is legal. There are thousands of affirmative action programs still alive, still viable in the United States today, and we need to fight to preserve them. And if you arm yourself with information, you can effectively do that.
So I'll make one comment and then I'll answer your question. So right now in the halls of Congress, there is an assault on everything related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It shows up in appropriations hearings, it shows up in the armed services hearing, it's showing up everywhere. So there is an attempt to try and paint everything as wokeness and affirmative action. And here's how they portray it. It's a zero-sum game. If we do something to lift up and help Black communities or other communities of color, then we're taking something away from someone else. That is patently false. And we have to push back against that with our voices and to be loud and clear and distinct about that. Number two, the big takeaway that I want you all to remember is that safe and secure housing is not just a civil right or a human right. It is the way that most Black families and individuals build wealth. And I come back to the ability to rent and show a renting history, which can be converted into the ability to purchase something. So again, it's a human right, it's a civil right, but it is exactly how we build wealth.
Thank you. That is a perfect note to end on. Thank you all for being here today. I think the conversation should continue, so please find us either here or in the hallways because this is really important work. So thank you so much to all the panelists and to all of you for being here.
Thank you.